Hello everyone. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at naming variables in Python. And when I finished putting up together the part 3 variables there, it occurred to me that there's actually some interesting rules that are probably should be established right away when it comes to naming variables. So we're going to be taking a look at kind of what works and what doesn't today. So we're going to go ahead and create ourselves a couple logical variables here. Now, the way we're going to approach this is we're going to attack it based on trying to create a mathematical formula. And we're going to basically show you sort of how things get complicated once you start going a little too far out with it. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be calculating force. Force equals mass times acceleration. Again, well, we haven't talked about variable assignment yet, but we're going to take a look at that later on. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and create ourselves some variables based on these different components. Now, there's a lot of different names we can use for variables. One thing we could do is we could do F for force. Let's say we don't calculate force. And we could do M times A. We could do something like that. Now, these are all valid variable names. Now, we should probably assign a value for it. So we'll say our mass is 10. We'll say our acceleration is 10. Again, keeping it very simple for today. But one of the things you'll observe is it is not very clear what each one of these variables actually means. So we have an F, we have an M, we have an A. And of course, if we went back and reused these later on, that could get a little messy and make it very difficult to identify. Now, some people use single character variables a lot whenever you're using certain types of loops. Like if you're using a while loop that counts, for example, many people will use just a C instead of the word counter just to make it simpler. But if something has to be meaningful, we have to be able to identify what it is. Otherwise, we're going to have some challenges being able to use it later on. So let's go ahead and rename these. We'll go ahead and do mass. We'll do acceleration. And then we'll come down here and we'll clean this up. Acceleration, this is the nice thing about PyCharm. Mass, we'll come over here to the word force, and we'll just write out the word force. Now, this is much more clear of a name. Now, this works really well. Now, things get a little complicated with variables because this is a relatively straightforward example. What unit is mass? What unit is acceleration? Now, for those of you who are SI unit experts, you're automatically going to know that we're probably dealing with grams or we're dealing with kilograms. Acceleration, we're most certainly going to be doing meters per second squared. So one of the things that people usually recommend is when you're doing any variable that has some kind of value associated with some kind of unit is to actually append the unit onto the name of the variable. So for example, if we're doing mass, I would actually do underscore kg. And the reason this is so useful is this will tell us exactly what unit we're dealing with. This is especially really important if you're doing a lot of different conversions. For example, if I were using slugs, if I were using the imperial units versus the metric units, it works really well. Now, of course, I can come up here and be even more specific. I can do mass like this. And of course, I can go in here force n. Now, there's another thing you probably notice here, and that's the fact that these units are very now clear. I know exactly what I'm dealing with. You'll also observe that I'm using these little underscores in order to separate my unit from the name of the variable. The reason that this is so helpful is it basically allows me to break it up. So let's say here, if I did streetcar, for example, that's kind of hard. If I wanted to do red streetcar, I'll do that one, make a nice one. That looks pretty good. We'll do fast red streetcar. There we go. You can see that our variable will say 1. Why not? This is a relatively complicated name for a variable. There's a lot of little components here, of course. If we want it to be goofy, we can, there we go. Now that's a nasty looking variable. Fast red streetcar is now here or nowhere? Uh-oh, what do we do? So one of the things they'll tell us to do is to actually come in here and actually go ahead and pop in these little underscores to decide what we want. So obviously our streetcar is now here. So we make this a true because obviously it's a Boolean. And this is a little bit more clear. Now, some of you are probably saying, well, I happen to use Java and that's not how we do it. So that's okay. And again, not all Java users are like that. I'm a Java user and you can hear what I sound like. They would do something that looks like this. They would do fast red street car is now here. True. And the nice thing about this, of course, is called camel case, by the way, is this is just not how we do things in Python, because Python, the designers by design, want to avoid capital letters. I think they're just allergic to capital letters, but I think the true story is that maybe the shift key was broken on the person's keyboard when they were designing. That's not true. But it is one of those things that we try to avoid capitals in everything except for things that have to be capitalized. So for us, this one is the no-go. I'll go ahead and delete that one here. This is how we would write this. Now, you're probably sitting here going, this is kind of long and wordy and kind of a pain in the butt. It's pretty painful to use this one. I agree. One of the things you have to do with variables is you have to kind of balance the needs of being clear in the variable with what the variable is actually trying to achieve. So always be mindful of this. Now, in the real world, we'd probably have a streetcar object. We'd have something like streetcar dots here equals true. We have something like that. But again, that's going to be much, 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 much later on in order to make this done. Now, Python has a couple other rules when it comes to variables. For one, we cannot have a variable start with a number. Again, we can't say one car equals 5. Again, we'll say true. Again, just using Booleans to be cheap here. If I run this, Python's going to have a heart attack because it's going to be like, you can't do that. A 1 is a 1, buddy. We can, of course, come in here and do car1 equals true. That's valid. If I ever press run again, you'll see it's perfectly happy with that. It's not going to give us any heart attacks or anything along those lines. That's pretty cool. Now, an interesting thing in Python is underscores are allowed for variable names. And you're sitting there going, oh, please don't do that. Yes, you can do extremely obnoxious variables like that. You're allowed to do that. And I think it's a little goofy. Again, you'll see people do things like this all the time. Some people do stuff like this. This actually has a special meaning in Python, but you're not going to see that for about a month when you're looking at classes later on. So that actually is a kind of a cool thing. But it is considered okay to do that as a variable. So if you want to be that guy, you could do underscore car1. I don't know why you would do this. That's so painful. That is so darn painful. Other problems we're going to have in Python is we're going to be dealing with protected words. For example, there's a command called yield. Let's say I'm making a program that calculates crop yield. If I type in yield, you'll notice it instantly turns orange and it screams at me because it's a protected program word already built into our buddy Python here. We can't override this with something else. I can say crop yields, and then if we want to be efficient here, we can do liters or something like that. We'll keep it L equals 5. Again, keep it simple here. This is a much better name for it. It's also much more clear for what you're trying to achieve. Now, another thing you're not going to see too often in variables are allowed variables. And the reason you're not going to see all capital letters is usually from a style perspective, all capital letters indicate something that is supposed to be a constant. Now, the reason this is very helpful for us is it tells the programmer, hey, you're not supposed to change this variable. You might want to be careful with it when you're doing that. Let's say, for example, I want to do something nice and complicated. I'll do air resistance. Newtons, actually capital N for newtons. See, I hate that. Air resistance in newtons is going to be velocity. We haven't created any of these. Velocity squared, let's see, times rho. Then we're going to talk about that in a second. Velocity squared times rho. Let's see here. We need frontal area. This would be an M2. Let's see here. What else we're going to need here? We're also going to need a coefficient of drag coefficient. It's unitless, so it keeps it nice and simple. So we have a bunch of really, really angry messages in here. But one of the things you notice is I went ahead and capitalized rho. Rho is simply going to refer to air pressure. Now, if we were doing air pressure at sea level, we do something that looks like this. And by capitalizing it, you're not doing anything special in the code. You're letting me, the programmer, know that velocity is a variable. It's going to change. Rho is a constant. Don't mess with it. Frontal area meter squared I can change. And drag coefficient, of course, is something that I can change. And of course, then we'd have to go through and create each of these variables individually. That's so much better. So now the red angle went away because I actually went through and created all those variables. Now the cool thing is I can change the velocity a bunch of times, but I know please don't mess with rho because I'm taking, again, if we wanted to be a little bit more precise here, we could actually probably just do straight up air density like that, air density. And that would basically be letting folks know, hey, just so you know, you're not supposed to change this variable. So as you can see, there's a lot of really, really good little habits when it comes to naming variables in Python. One thing I did not mention is making this boo-boo. Helps if you spell variable right correct. You're not allowed to have spaces. That's just simply something that you're not able to do. And it's just kind of one of those little pieces that you just have to kind of be mindful of. And another problem I forgot to mention too, as I'm kind of going down my little list here, is don't make this mistake. If I do x equals 5 and x equals 5, these two are not the same variable. I can't say that enough. Just because it's an x doesn't mean it's an x. A lot of beginning students will write out really beautiful long variables and they'll have capital letters in weird places, and that'll cause things not to work because it's not the same name as a variable. Of course, this is naughty too because we're doing a capital letter anyway, so that's something we want to be kind of careful with. So as you can see, there's a lot of different kind of just general rules for naming variables in Python. This is pretty good. When people ask what works best, I actually think this is pretty good. This did a nice job. I really, really, really want to make that a capital N there, but I'm going to resist. I'm going to do the Python thing, not the SI thing. Obviously, if we had other types of N's for air resistance, we'd have to play with that a little bit. But it does give you a great idea of what your code can look like, and it makes it so much easier to understand when you have to go back and make changes. Enjoy.